Good morning, everybody. So, my interest in this matter is about 15 years old, in the sense that I became a magistrate, a normal criminal magistrate, about 15 years ago. And since then, I've taken on also being a youth magistrate and a family magistrate. And it's an interest I have in the House of Lords and general criminal justice things. I was active in the Domestic Abuse Bill, now Act, including pre-legislative scrutiny. So I've got a number of interests in this area, a number of perspectives. So one perspective, which I think is relevant, is where I sit as a criminal adult magistrate in London and Westminster, Westminster Magistrates Court. We have a specialist domestic violence court there, which is the only one in London. I don't know whether it's the only one in the country. And there we get additional support through local authorities to review domestic abuse cases to basically help us make decisions on sentencing and, more importantly, on bail decisions. So what this means is that the local authorities, they are separate people who sit at the back of court, and if we've got, say, an allegation of common assault or something like that, they will go and look at the local authority information on the wider family about whether there's a history of allegations, not convictions, just allegations of domestic abuse. And that will inform our decision on bail. So it's a important development of practice, if I can put it like that, for those types of cases. And in my 15 years as a magistrate, I have definitely seen a far greater awareness of domestic abuse as a factor in violence. And obviously we've seen the Act, which I referred to as well. As I mentioned, I also sit in youth and family courts. In family courts, where we're dealing basically with both public and private law, it's very, very common to see allegations of domestic violence and counter allegations, both between usually the man and the woman. And so it is very often a factor we're happy to take into account when we're making decisions about the arrangements for the children, whether it's private or public law arrangements. Now, one of the reasons I'm interested in this group is because one of its main campaigning things is to try and campaign for a domestic violence against men and boys strategy. Because one of the things I've observed through all the lobbying I get as a member of parliament is it's very, very, it's sort of 99% looking at women as victims. Whereas my own experience, I would say that's too high a percentage. I would personally put it about 80% as women are victims. It just so happens the last two cases I've dealt with in adult crime, the men have been the victim. I've actually relatively recently done two cases where the man was the victim. And the court, we take that into account and we dealt with it in the normal procedure. But I think it is fair from my own perception to say that there isn't an acknowledgement that men are a victim of domestic violence as well, although probably almost certainly in a smaller proportion. But also men are even more reluctant than women to come forward and admit they are victims of domestic abuse. So that's why I'm interested in this subject. I think it does permeate a lot of different things that the criminal justice system deals with. And it's why I'm interested in hearing what you as experts have got to say about this. Just to conclude by saying, I don't think of myself as an expert at all. I've just got my own specific experiences, which I've explained to you. So I am interested to hear what real experts have to say about this and how we could contribute and encourage the government to look at this issue in a more holistic way. Anyway, that's what I want to say by means of introduction. And I think turn to Mike now, who's going to read out Vera Baird's statement.
Okay, so unfortunately she was unable to come. She sent this statement, which I'm going to read out. It is with great regret that I'm unable to attend today's event and speak on this vital topic as I had intended to do. Unfortunately, a Home Office board meeting, of which the Victims Commissioner is a key member, was convened and regrettably clashes with your meeting. I'd like to send my apologies and my best wishes for the event today. I do hope to be invited to speak in person at a future date where I can also have a chance to hear you share your views. The work you do is important. It has long been my view, and I have spoken out on this several times in the past year, that there is insufficient focus on the men and boys in the drive to tackle sexual violence, domestic abuse, and other forms of interpersonal violence, such as so-called honor-based abuse. Men and boys suffer a number of unique barriers when it comes to reporting and seeking help. This includes harmful stereotyping and popular myths and misconceptions around male victims. In particular, notions of masculinity and perceptions of how men should act or behave can act as powerful deterrents to coming forward and accessing help. The provision of specialist victim support for men and boys is also limited and lacking. As survivors of abuse, men and boys deserve to be fully supported in a way that is tailored to their needs and helps them to cope and recover. I have consistently argued that men and boys who are victims of interpersonal violence require their own strategy. The drivers of abuse differ, and in turn, the harms and impacts are experienced differently. Men and boys deserve better than the recent lackluster Home Office efforts. It is beyond time for the design of a dedicated men and boys strategy with specific policies, strategic targets, milestones, and funding, which sits independently of the Violence Against Women and Girls VAWG strategy. Physical and sexual violence and domestic abuse against men and boys is not violence against women and girls, as we saw in the title to the recent document. The Home Office must stop being tone deaf on this issue and commit to a separate consultation and separate strategy for male victims. You can find statements on this issue on my website, including my response to the Home Office policy document in April this year, my response to the Victims' Law consultation in February, and an article in my 2020-21 annual report, July 21. I think that's quite a powerful statement.
Now we're moving on to Duncan Craig, is that right?
Yeah.
Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lord Ponsonby. First of all, thank you to the APPG for inviting me to come and speak. So it was very nice to be referred to as a national expert, but I'm far from a national expert. There are so many other people who describe themselves as experts, and I certainly don't want to be taking and overshadowing them. What I will say is that I have quite a long length of time working in this sector, in the sector of male sexual violence. And it was interesting, Lord Ponsonby, to hear you say that about 15 years ago, you kind of became interested in this area. So when you became interested in this area, I was talking and speaking out quite loudly for the first time about the sexual abuse, rape and sexual exploitation that I'd experienced round about 15 years ago, which all stemmed from my training to be a psychotherapist and desperately needing some help and support and finding that there was none because I identified as male because I was a big boy and whilst there was many services supporting women and girls, there was no services supporting boys and men, and I actually had to travel over 200 miles to get my support. I live in Greater Manchester, and so decided as soon as I'd got to a point of some level of stability, and which is an ongoing process, certainly. That we would, if nobody was doing anything for us, then we would do something ourselves. And 13 years ago, we opened the doors in Greater Manchester. Survivors Manchester was born. Since then, we've supported nearly 5,000 male survivors of sexual abuse, rape, and sexual exploitation. We are currently receiving 2 to 3 brand new referrals every single day, 365 days of the year. And when I say brand new referrals, I mean they're men that we've never met before, they're men that have never reached out before. We've seen a 124% increase in referrals from last year to this year, and annually it goes up, continues to goes up time and time and time again. My issue that I hold quite for quite a long time and quite near and dear to my heart is to do with the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. I've been involved with the strategy and the work since 2009, and it's always confused me as to why many of my Westminster colleagues, many colleagues across the health sector, refer to the rape and sexual exploitation and childhood sexual abuse that I experienced as being a crime against women and girls, because I'm not a woman or a girl. And I've never had any sensible explanation as to why this is. Back in 2019, round about the 6th of March 2019, which I like to think this happened on this day because it was my birthday, although I'm sure government would disagree with that, that a brand new, for the first time ever, statement was issued by government, which was a position paper on boys and men affected by crimes across government that are associated with violence against women and girls. And I'm really proud of that statement because along with a very small handful of other people, my wonderful friends and colleagues such as Ali and Mark Brooks were central in helping write that position statement. That for me was a first step. I am far from not interested in the slightest in trying to pull down Fogg. I'm very much interested in building Fogg up. I think we have to tackle the way that women and girls are treated across the world, not just in this country. And I've definitely experienced, had insight, into the experiences of women and girls as I've been so lucky and fortunate to work and be invited to go and work in America, Uganda, New Zealand, around sexual violence. And I've seen and heard some horrific things. And I think as a man, as a cisgendered man, it's my responsibility to do everything I can to ensure that my sisters and mothers and grandmas and friends, etc., are protected because they need protection. I need protection too, and my fellow survivors need protection, not because women and girls get it, but because boys and men deserve it. And there's a really big difference there for me. I am interested less in talking about why the violence against women and girls strategy is wrong. I'm more interested in why we haven't got an interpersonal violence strategy against men and boys. As I said, I'm confused still. I'm very honoured to be often asked to be at different tables with different ministers, been a member of a number of working groups, task and finish groups, and really proud to have been involved in the original victim strategy, in the violence against women and girls strategy. I've given evidence at a number of times at select committees. I am really proud and really honoured to have been part of many of these things, but I go right back to why haven't we got and interpersonal violence against men and boys strategy, because for the 1 in 6, for people like me, the 1 in 6 of us who as males will be affected by sexual violence at some point in our life, for the 1 in 10 rapes that will be male, and for all of the over 72,000 boys every single year that are sexually violated, for all of those, for all of my fellow survivors, I want to know why, because I matter. The abuser tried to make me realize that I didn't matter. The abuser and the abusers tried to take away my power. And it's taken years. Duncan. Yeah, 2 minutes. No problem. It's taken me years to get that power back, only to be told, once I feel like I'm in a stable position, that what happened to me is a crime against women and girls. I think that there is not only a desperate need to correct this for men and boys, but I also think that if we are really serious as a society in tackling women and girls, then we need to not be presenting reports about violence against women and girls that contain data pertaining to men and boys, because women and girls deserve to have a strategy and deserve our attention in delivering a strategy which is focused on them and not diluted and mixed up and confusing people by the information containing men and boys. It's not rocket science. There's far more complicated things in the world that need a lot of due care and attention. This is a really, really simple solution. It's a complex problem that requires a simple solution, which is the delivery of a strategy that tackles interpersonal violence against men and boys, looking at the threats that we have within society, and looking at how can we make and provide support, policy, processes and decisions that are in the best interest of me and my fellow survivors. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Duncan. So the next is Liz Bates, Dr. Elizabeth Bates, who from the University of Cumbria, a national expert on male victims of sexual abuse and violence. So this may be somebody who will admit to being an expert. So far, none of us have admitted to being experts.
No, I certainly can't promise to admit to anything like that. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. So I work at the University of Cumbria, but I'm also a trustee of the Mankind Initiative, and I'm current chair of the British Psychological Society's male psychology section. So I have an investment, and the work that I've done over the last 10 years has been involved in exploring men's experiences of domestic violence and understanding how it fits within this wider sector and what we can do to help and support them. So my little contribution today is really about trying to address and kind of understand and highlight the barriers that men face in help seeking, and how the current strategy and the impact of a proposed potential parallel strategy could really support actually how we could support men as well. I know I have 10 minutes, and as an academic, we're not used to keeping it short, so I'll try my very best. So we know that men experience barriers to help seeking broadly across a range of different areas, including health-related behaviours. So, for example, men are less likely than women to go to the doctors for health-related problems, etc. So we know that there are those sort of issues there. But when it comes to domestic violence, we know that there are specific barriers that they face. And there are three sort of issues that kind of come together to possibly trebly stigmatise men in this area. So one is that, generally speaking, victims of domestic violence are known as having, or it's like kind of been a lot of the models that have looked at barriers to help seeking have talked about this idea of it being a stigmatised identity because of the nature of the fact that it's in the home, the nature of the relationships that it involves. So the wider literature that has looked at men's and women's experiences has talked about this idea of it being stigmatised as an identity. We also then have the stereotypes that men are perpetrators and women are victims. And that is a stereotype that I think has originated out of the fact that a lot of the early research that was done in this area was driven really by that women's liberation movement and the feminist movement, which did such a huge amount in raising awareness of domestic violence as an issue. And we can really credit the fact we're having this conversation to that. But one of the things it did do, I think, is focus on one particular perpetrator and victim group, which has created this stereotype that domestic violence is something that men do to women. But also there is a really powerful and long-standing discourse, obviously, within the sort of wider sector, within the policy and the practice and the funding, that has been quite gendered, that talks about men as perpetrators and women as victims, and uses has historically sometimes used words like vast majority, when the crime survey statistics would suggest that 1 in 3 victims of domestic violence are male. So it's a majority female, but not anywhere near of what I would personally label a vast majority. So these factors come together to stigmatise men in their attempts to help seek, to really sort of create these barriers that men experience in help seeking. And it also is influenced, and the literature is littered with examples of the ways in which men have described gender stereotypes treatment. So my own research, and I've published a number of papers in the area using qualitative data of men's accounts. So I have a number of examples I can think of where men talk about not being believed when they've tried to ask for help, being laughed at, being accused of being the perpetrator, the assumption that you must have done something to deserve it. So that kind of narrative is really fed into and affects how men are treated. And what that means is that within then this wider system where men are attempting to get help, having already been a victim of domestic violence, they are then at risk of the potential for what we call secondary victimisation, where systems and support services are then actually serving to victimise them further through some of these mechanisms. So one particular paper that I just wanted to talk about was one that I did with Dr. Julie Taylor at the University of Cumbria and a couple of our students. And we looked at the barriers to help seeking that men experienced. We worked in a particular way that I'll kind of comment on in a minute, that was to really try and get a wider range of experience of men to understand actually what are the barriers to help seeking for people that have asked for help, but also importantly for those that never have. So there were a number of factors that had come up within the data, and I've just included some quotes on the slide here because I think that the voices of these men is really important in highlighting this. But there were a number of factors that really play a part in this stigma, and you can see that it falls into sort of things around the media, service providers, a lack of visible services, and the language of the legislation. So what this means is that the message that we are seeing in wider society, whether it's through the media, whether it's through the training that some service providers receive, whether it's the fact that the services are not particularly visible to men, or men don't know if they're able to access those or approach those, but also this importance of how we talk about Fogg and violence against women and girls and domestic violence sitting under this sort of umbrella strategy. What it does is it serves to give a message to men that they can't be victims of domestic violence because they're not a woman or girl. So what it means is that their experience is something that not only do they find harder to recognise themselves, so there's research that suggests men can identify domestic violence behaviours that are happening to them, but then will not actually identify as a victim of domestic violence because that's what happens to women. So it really does serve to sort of impact and create barriers in terms of their own recognition, the support and the responses that they receive, and also just generally speaking, actually how we talk about men's victimisation across wider society. So where we position, sorry, I've put IPV because in the research we also talk about intimate partner violence specifically, but where we position domestic violence under this framework, what it does is it unfortunately serves to exacerbate this issue because, as I say, men don't see themselves within the legislation or the service provision. I did a recent paper with Emily Douglas, who was one of the really early researchers in this area. Interesting that 2 people have mentioned 15 years ago. 15 years ago was around the time the first first in-depth qualitative exploration of men's experiences was published. And Emily Douglas was one of those really early researchers. But we reviewed victim services that were available for domestic violence within the UK and the US. And they were both suffering from very similar issues around the fact that the legislation or the guidance or the narrative is still so heavily gendered. It creates a real barrier for men who are seeking help and are trying to kind of access that help and support as a vulnerable group who have experienced violence. So we kind of called for this idea of a policy and a legislation that's inclusive in name and in spirit. Because then when we have this strategy, not only does it impact on the way in which men recognise their own experiences, but it filters then into how we talk about domestic violence. So having domestic violence under the umbrella of VAMB means that that's how the public and the wider sort of society will see domestic violence sitting. So it sits under violence against women and girls. Lots of sort of gendered language is still used in this area. So it feeds into that stereotype that exists. And unfortunately, on a sort of more on a personal, sort of interpersonal level with these men, is unfortunately this means that sometimes these systems can be abused by, my research focuses particularly on women as perpetrators, but obviously this applies across the board. But it does mean that sometimes then women can use these systems as an additional way to abuse and control their male partners and pre and post separation. And this is something that within the literature we call legal and administrative aggression. So for me, the importance of a parallel strategy is that it would allow us to work in a much more gender responsive and a gender inclusive way. And I do not favour or support this idea of gender neutral. I don't think, work in a gender neutral way when society is still so heavily influenced by gender. But if we could work in this responsive and inclusive way, it would give us the opportunity to develop and understand the needs of different groups, to look at actually how we can best support men and boys who are experiencing interpersonal violence. And then also that can kind of feed into then men of other different intersecting identities as well, because we are talking about men and boys here, obviously very generally, but actually there are loads of different intersecting identities that will have different specific responsive needs that we need to think about. So a strategy that is dedicated then to working for and understanding men and boys in this way would then allow that to be something we can explore in more detail. I'm going to get a 2-minute warning, I think, soon. An example of this would be, like, in terms of working in a very gender responsive or gender inclusive way, just a couple of things. One would be that we give opportunities for women to disclose their experiences, for example, in healthcare settings where we are more routinely asking women if they've ever experienced something. We don't ask men, and where that safe space is still there potentially for them to disclose, the research suggests that actually direct questioning is something really crucial for male victims. They're not likely to just disclose given the opportunity, but if asked, that could prompt that. Anonymity is something that's really important in that initial disclosure that we know, again, from the research, from my own research with using an online qualitative survey that was anonymous. 25% of the men that had completed that had never told anybody else about their experience, and the Mankind Initiative helpline data suggests that 64% of them would not have of the men that are called would not have called if that hadn't been an anonymous helpline. They hadn't had to give any personal data. So the current policies and how the practice is, for me, again, a kind of one final thing is that we have talked a lot about the fact that this is the service and the polishing, the strategies and everything. We need men to overcome those barriers to kind of come and fit in what we offer. But for me, a parallel strategy would allow us to actually work to try and tailor services and support systems that were then more approachable and accessible to men. So we change to try and help them approach us rather than us expect them to change to come to see us. So the parallel strategy, I think, would just be really, really important to allow us to best understand and support the needs of men and boys better, and would complement then what is really excellent work that VAMB strategy has done in supporting women and girls.
Thank you very much, Liz. I think I will officially say you're an expert, even though you might not want to accept that.
Thank you.
That description yourself. Just to note that Michael Farmer's joined us, who is a colleague of mine in the House of Lords. Michael, you've got your hand up. I don't know whether that's because you want to say something, but anyway, you're very welcome.
Well, thanks, Fred. Well, you said there might be a question in the short break.
Yeah.
Certainly, you know, I very much appreciate what Duncan and Elizabeth are informing us. It's so needed to be heard. I just want to raise up the area of prisons, because I get involved in prisons a lot. And, you know, by and large, there's about 80,000 men in prison and 4,000 women. I mean, the difference is huge. And yet there's this huge emphasis on keeping women out of prison and sort of understanding the sort of criminogenic reasons that are behind their behavior. But there isn't that understanding or that approach to men in prisons. And particularly, as we've heard from Elizabeth, the sort of secondary victimizations that go on in our society that can lead men who have been abused and who have what we call, you know, for children, it's adverse childhood experiences, but lead them on into areas of broken relationships, which can end up in prison themselves. And there's no emphasis on looking at the male prison population in the same way that we look at the female one, as to why they're there and what can be done to not keep them there. So I'm just bringing that particular.
Elizabeth, do you want to comment on that point?
I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you. Within the wider literature, for example, on domestic violence, that's the area that I know the best. A number of men that are in prison for domestic violence offences have histories of childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, as you've already mentioned, and some of the current interventions that we have in terms of addressing their violence and their needs don't always respond to that. So I think, again, this could be a really good opportunity for us to explore that in a bit more detail. I also think that there is the stereotypes that exist around violence, particularly for domestic violence, are that because men are seen as the more aggressive gender, and so that aggression is in line with that gender role, it then also sometimes means that when women are violent, we spend more time trying to understand why, whereas men are just violent, so that's just that. Whereas actually, if this woman's being violent and women aren't normally violent, there must be a reason for that. So again, it's the kind of approach and that professional curiosity, I suppose that's what Mark always says, that professional curiosity to actually try and understand the reasons behind that would ultimately best help us address those needs and help those reduce reoffending and reduce offending in the first place, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question and answer, if I may say so. Are there any other points that people want to put to Liz? Okay, shall we move on then? So it's Ali Fogg's up next. And they've got a coordinating role. So Ali, tell us about the campaigning and your own, you know, why you're here.
Thank you, Lord Ponsonby, for the opportunity, and to all the committee for holding this meeting today. It's really incredibly important. With your permission, I won't say too much about myself and the campaign, because I've only got 10 minutes in this lot, and I've got a lot of, I think, probably more important things to talk about than me. And my imposter syndrome won't even begin to engage with an expert discourse here, so we'll pass over that as well. What I would like to use my time today for is to raise a couple of questions which are key and fundamental to the discussion we're having here today, and which they're not hypothetical. We have put these questions to the Home Office on multiple occasions, and nobody has ever been able to answer these questions. So if anyone here in the room today is able to help us get answers to these questions, we'd be very grateful. And in the meantime, I think they'll probably help to illustrate the Alice in Wonderland absurdity of the kind of issues that we're dealing with here. So this is me. I'm chair of the Men and co-founder of the Men&Boys Coalition, which was came together actually around some of these issues around 2015 initially. And we, in a nutshell, we do our best to represent the men's health and well-being sector in the corridors of power amongst everywhere else. And the two questions I wanted to raise with you today are these. The one that Duncan touched on earlier, who decided to categorize men and boys who have been victims of sexual abuse, domestic violence, and other forms of exploitation as victims of violence against women and girls? And more importantly, why? And the second question I'll come on to is, what is the role and function of the Home Office's position statement on male victims, the other document that Duncan mentioned earlier? First of all, let me give you a very quick history lesson as to why we have a violence against women and girls strategy in the first place. And I will say from the outset that I fully and unequivocally support a violence against women and girls strategy. And I have no issues, no complaints about the conception and the delivery of the strategy, except with regard to the inclusion of men and boys where they don't belong. Back in 1993, the UK government signed up to the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and in 2010 to the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe. Both of these treaties committed the UK government to considering violence against women and girls, not just as an issue of criminality, but of gender equality and human rights. The signing of these treaties led to the creation of a violence against women and girls strategy. And when it first came out in 2010, I've got empty quote marks there on the page in front of you, because the original document that came out in November 2010 had no mention of male victims whatsoever. And why would it? Because men and boys are not victims of violence against women and girls. But over the 5 and 10 years after that, slowly, every update that the Home Office put out had another mention of male victims, just sneaking in here and there. And accompanying that, the definitions began to change. So by 2013, the definition said, as you can see there, violence against women and girls refers to types of abuse that are predominantly experienced by this group. However, there are also male victims of most of these crimes who need support and protection. I don't actually disagree with that statement as far as it goes, but by 2021, the current update of the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy said this: a note on terminology, the term violence against women and girls refers to acts of violence or abuse that we know disproportionately affect women and girls. And throughout this strategy, this refers to all victims of any of these offences. Now, before we move on, I'd like to point out that the reasoning given in that 2021 quote makes no sense whatsoever. I don't need to spell this out to you. Very obviously, this does not apply in any other realm of public policy. The overwhelming majority of rough sleeping homeless people are men, but we don't talk about all homeless people as homeless men. You can come up with any number of examples or equivalents, but there is no other area of public policy where this applies. And the second point I'd make is that while these definitions changed between 2010 and 2021, at no stage was there any kind of accountability or justification for the shift in that definition. No minister ever stood up in Parliament to announce it. No official was ever asked to explain or justify it to any committee. And perhaps most importantly of all, at no time did anyone ask male survivors or our representative organisations how we felt about being categorised as victims of violence against women and girls. It's a definition that's been entirely imposed upon us without consideration or consent. And when you think about the context of the issues we're dealing with here, that's actually quite profound and quite disturbing. So one final question before I move on this. Who actually supports the inclusion of male victims in the VOG strategy? We know no one in the men's sector, in the victim support sector, supports it. We know the Victims Commissioner doesn't. We know most of our colleagues and friends in the women's sector don't support it. And I've never been able to find anyone who will actually stand up and say, yes, I think this is a good idea. It's just something that's happened, I presume, as an issue of kind of bureaucratic convenience for the sake of civil servants in the Home Office. We've not been able to find any other explanation for it at all. Now, in keeping with the question of who actually supports this, about 18 months ago, there was a major Home Office consultation on the refresh of the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. They asked us as the men's sector to reach out to our colleagues and to our service users and to male victims and survivors to engage with this process. To the best of our knowledge, dozens of organisations and hundreds of individual survivors contributed to this consultation exercise. And yet nothing we told them appears to have made it through. So about 2 months ago now, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Home Office asking, what had male survivors actually told you as part of this consultation? You went to all this effort to collect and use up the time and enormous amounts of emotional energy from male survivors to talk through their experiences, to explain to you how they feel. What have you done with the information that we gave you? The answers, yet again, have been unforthcoming. And if I ever do get a response to that FOI request, I'll be happy to update the committee. That brings me on to our second question. What is the role and the purpose and the function of the Home Office's position statement on male victims? I should say this is what the position statement now looks like. When you may recall, when this document was first published in March 22, there was a degree of outrage in the media, particularly on social media, because it was given a title that made no sense to anyone. The reason it made no sense to anyone is because the conceptualization that the Home Office are using of male victims of crimes against violence, male victims of violence against women and girls makes no sense. When we raised the theoretical problems with this document, the Home Office's response was to withdraw the document and publish it with a new title. So it now looks like this. It doesn't actually address any of the issues, but that's what it is. It might sound unbelievable, but there was a period of about 4 or 5 years during which male victims and survivors were apparently included in the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and we simply never knew because nobody bothered to tell us. When we pieced it together, we began to, as Duncan mentioned earlier, some of us began to lobby and badger the Home Office to clarify what was going on, and the upshot of that was the 2019 position statement. And then a few years later, the 2022 update, which is the one we're now looking at. Now, the 2019 version was, to be generous, a rather flimsy document. It didn't say much. The 2022 version is, on its own terms, actually rather good. It's useful. It tells us that the government understands the horrifying extent of intimate violence against men and boys and the complexities of the situations that male victims find themselves in, including the intersections of male gender issues with race and ethnicity and sexuality and disability, social exclusion. All of these points are made very well in the document.
2 minutes, please, 2 minutes.
Gotcha. It also includes this absolutely crucial line. Whilst acknowledging the disproportionately, I'm clear my own screen, whilst acknowledging the disproportionately gendered nature of VOG, we will ensure the government VOG communication campaigns are inclusive of male victims to raise awareness, challenge harmful societal myths about masculinity, and encourage male victims and survivors to report abuse. This is great, we need it. The problem is the Home Office do not tell anyone else involved in violence against women and girls strategy that this is what their position is. Some examples. The Deputy Chief Constable Maggie Bly is currently tasked by the Home Office with delivering this national framework on policing violence against women and girls. Now, she has made it very clear, both in her published documents and in meetings with some of the sector, some of the people here today, that as far as she is concerned, policing violence against women and girls is about policing violence against women and girls. Male victims are not included in her work. She does not address the circumstances which led to the serial killer, Stephen Port, continuing to murder and rape and abuse a succession of young men and boys in London over the last decade, or the situations that emerged in Manchester where the serial rapist Reynard Sanaga attacked over 200 victims that we know of, all of them men. And these issues are simply not a concern. So the idea that the National Violence Against Women and Girls strategy is addressing issues for male victims is fundamentally false. Second example, at the very same month that the Home Office and the Home Secretary herself was launching the position statement that I just showed you, which was committing to being fully inclusive of male victims, they also launched this campaign called Enough. Here's one page of it. Just look at some of the examples. Ask the women and girls you know if they've ever felt threatened, harassed, controlled, or coerced, and the answer is likely to be yes. Any behavior that embarrasses, demeans, frightens, or distresses women and girls is abuse, and it has to stop. There's pages and pages and pages of this. The best example, perhaps, are you worried about your behavior? Have you ever made sexual comments about a woman to your mates, made suggestive comments to a woman when they were clearly unwelcome, pressured a woman for sex until she gave in, and so on and so on and so on? This is what the government considers to be communications that are fully inclusive of violence against men and boys. Now, when we raised this with the Home Office, I went back a short while later and they'd added this little footnote. A word about terminology. Throughout this website, we talk about abuse towards women and girls because we know these behaviours disproportionately affect them, but the support offered here is available to all victims of any of these harms. This is what they mean by a fully inclusive communications programme for men and boys as victims of violence against women and girls. It is, to be blunt, a nonsense. My final point, before I move on, now, this week, the Home Office is running an open competition to fund voluntary organisations to deliver this work, Preventing BAWG and the Supporting Children Fund. Last week, I was at a meeting for bidders or people who are interested in bidding for this work. And I raised the question, are the bidders who will be delivering this work, which will involve going into schools, talking to children, working with youth groups, working with communications materials that will directly address young people, are bidders obliged to adhere to the Home Office's definition of violence against women and girls? In other words,
time, please, Ali. Time, please.
Okay, gotcha. The answer. Oh, sorry. The answer came back to me that none. Stop share. There is no obligation on any organisation to recognise that male victims even exist, and there were organisations involved at the meeting that I know for a fact have a stated position that domestic violence against men is not domestic violence. So we are in a position where the Home Office could soon be funding, part of the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, work which directly contradicts a key component of their own Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. Why? Because the position statement is meaningless. It does not actually say what the government cares about, and it's why it's no longer fit for purpose. And what we urgently need is a set-aside parallel strategy that meets the unique gender-specific needs of male victims and men and boys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're now moving on to a sort of general discussion, unless people have got specific points for Ali. I see that Duncan's put a couple of comments in the chat. The second comment's about the case he was talking about in Manchester, I think, was it? And the first one was commenting on Michael Farmer's comments about men in prison. Are there people who haven't spoken yet who would like to make a comment or sort of enter into the debate on things? Mike.
Yeah. On this question of how this strange definition crept in, I think that we shouldn't overlook the importance of the Istanbul Convention, because it is word for word out of the Istanbul Convention. The scary thing is the government is about to ratify this convention, which contains the strange definition. And it seems to me that this alignment, which Ali has identified, is to keep the government policy in alignment with the Istanbul Convention. And I think this is something which has been overlooked, the importance of which has been overlooked. That is, it appears to be an international convention on violence against women and girls, but it does contain these very strange definitions.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point. Are there other people who want to comment?
Yes, I'm Martin Seeger, a clinical psychologist. So coming up, this is my clinical angle, really. Just to say a brief comment that we've got to join all these things up, and that if it's a big priority of government now to prevent suicide, and suicide is if we're going to use this gendered language, then obviously suicide is you could say, the big majority of suicides are by men. And if we want to look into there's equal lack of curiosity about the lives of men as to why they take their own lives, but domestic abuse, being the victim of, and then the secondary victimization of not being listened to and actually re-traumatized because you've been abused in the first place, and then the system itself is denying your abuse. I mean, I've seen people who've been abused in families, boys and girls, whose own families didn't believe them. And so if society's like a big family, if society doesn't believe in you when your voice is expressed, that is a big secondary abuse on top of the original abuse. And if we want to prevent suicide, then we have to link that into the lives of men who have been victims of abuse, both perhaps in adult relationships and also in child relationships, the adverse child experiences we've talked about. So, you know, we've got to have a joined up strategy for public health in our country. If we want children to be healthy, we want the men and women to get on with each other and to have healthy relationships. So this whole idea of gendering things in this way, we've either got to do it for everything and then start saying, why are we sending all men to die in wars and not women? You know, we could get ridiculous about gender, or we have to be inclusive and have parallel strategies. Everyone has an equal right to have their differences and their specific needs attended to, whatever their identity. And men, therefore, should be included in that. And domestic abuse and violence is one of the obvious areas where we're lacking. So I will stop there because I tend to ramble on once I get going on this theme. So thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else who wants to make points? Something which would be interesting for me, and maybe come back to Mike on this, is what you might see as the sort of the next stages in, you know, what you're going to do with this talk we're having now, and how the work of the all-party group might move forward.
Yes, that is something which we want to touch on, but I think you got a couple of hands up. I think Mark.
Have you? Oh, I'm sorry, I've missed those. I'm sort of skipping through.
I think Mark Brooks had his hand up.
Oh, Mark Brooks, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And just to echo, obviously, what the other speakers have said, and I think in terms of the next steps, it would be obviously to produce a report. But one of the things that we really asked the parliamentarians in the House of Lords and the Commons, and we've got a number of their staff in the Commons here as well, is to start to really ask the ministers how they're thinking about this, and actually start to ask those questions in the chambers. And I know Lord Ponsonby, you're doing that on Thursday, because from my understanding, and working with Duncan and Ali and Liz and lots of others here, is that we don't think the ministers are actually thinking about this, because we don't think they're being briefed to think about it. And that's one of the issues. I think they're being gatekeeped, and therefore for the politicians on the call, it's using your direct influence to have those conversations directly with ministers. Duncan and I and Ali have spoken personally to ministers about this, including the current Home Office Minister, Rachel McLean. And certainly, you know, it was clear when I spoke to her, she had not been briefed on these issues. So I think from our perspective, it's a request for the peers and the MPs to actually start to ask ministers to actually give this some thought and not to be gatekept by their civil servants.
I think that's a fair comment, I have to say, given my experience in the last few years. Duncan Craig.
Thank you. Yeah, to echo what Mark just said. Whilst we're talking about the specific kind of gendered needs, to coin a phrase, of men and boys, women and girls, I want to make sure that it's clear from my perspective, from my organisation's perspective, when we're talking about males, we're talking about all males, including trans men, including non-binary people who wish to access our male-specific service. I think that there's sometimes a danger when we talk about gendered strategies, that actually what we begin to do is we begin to speak about it in a really binary way and through the lens of a heteronormative thinking. So with the violence against women and girls strategy, I find it really difficult to see what about women who experience domestic violence in same-sex relationships. There's a really important need to recognise when we're thinking about female perpetrators, there's a big push from a certain section of society to only want to think about female perpetrators on male victims. And actually we need to think about female perpetrators on female victims, because, you know, my lesbian and gay sisters deserve to be heard as well. And then, you know, despite the fact that it seems to be seen as a debate, and I refuse to be involved in any debate of the existence of an individual, trans people also require our support. So for me, when we're talking about interpersonal violence against men and boys, I'm talking about all men and boys, regardless of their gender assigned at birth, religion, race, ethnicity, sexuality, etc., etc.
Okay, that's great. I think what's really important in the last few minutes, obviously, if people have got a specific point they want to raise, is we move on to this implementation, which Mark Brooks has started, because obviously it's not very useful just to have this seminar and then things to carry on. And the APPG is trying to work out effective ways to get government to do things. So if people have contributions in that area, that would be great.
I've got Ali Fogg. You wanted to come back?
Yes, thank you. Just very quickly on that. I mean, it very much echoes what Mark just said about using your access, but it would be just incredibly useful for us to have any civil servant or minister put on the spot to answer that question as to why men and boys are in the VAWG strategy in the first place. I'm absolutely convinced that there is nobody who's got an answer to that. If there ever was an answer, it's been lost in the mists of time, and I very much doubt there's anyone still employed in the Home Office who has got any memory of that decision ever being made. It's just kind of emerged out of the bureaucratic primordial pump. And the fact that no one can justify it, I think, is absolutely the key to this, because if no one is putting up a justification, then we can't argue against it. You know, if there's nobody defending it, then we can't challenge them in what they're saying. It just remains as it is. So I don't.
So just to say, Ali, just to say, for me as a novice on this, I think I've heard the answer to that point, and that was from Mike Bell, and that's because it's the wording in the original Istanbul Convention, which they're looking to ratify. Sorry, go ahead.
Can I slightly disagree with Mike on that one, though? Because the Istanbul Convention is absolutely clear that it's talking about women and girls. There is probably a misinterpretation that's going on. I mean, we should bear in mind the Istanbul Convention was published in 16 languages or something, and you will get very slightly different nuances. But I think people have used the Istanbul Convention as a justification and an excuse for what they've done, but it is not a reason, because there was never any intention by the people who drafted the Istanbul Convention that it should apply to male victims of these crimes. It just never occurred to them that that was even on the agenda.
Right, Mike wants to come back.
Please, yeah.
It may not have been their intention, but if you read the wording, when you define violence against women and girls as being that violence which predominantly affects women and girls, that leaves open the possibility of there being male victims. It does seem extraordinary that a document which is meant to be about tackling violence against women and girls does not have as a definition of that as the violence which affects women and girls.
I think if you read the whole paragraph, Mike,
it has a strange definition, and that because the wording, the identical wording, appears in this male position statement, there must be a link there. So I agree, it's not logical, or maybe not intended, but I'm suggesting it is the origin.
My feeling is that it has been used as a post facto rationalization for what they have done. gives the justification, but it shouldn't be taken as the explanation.
Michael Farmer, do you want to say something?
Thanks very well. Actually, it's almost a question to you, because you've got the oral question on Thursday, which I'm intending to sort of come to ask a supplementary. And I'm just taking this opportunity to say that to you, and to if anybody can or wants to give me a defined, real good question, feel free between now and then to back you up.
So I mean, it is actually one of the different things about the House of Lords is we actually fairly often tell the minister what the question is going to be, even the supplementary. I know they don't do this in the House of Commons, but it means you get a better answer because they've had a chance to think about it rather than just doing it on their feet.
Exactly.
So there we go. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much. I've found that a very interesting session. It's given lots of material for future work, I'm sure, and I look forward to playing an active part in this group. Mike, do you want to say anything before we close?
I need to thank everybody who came, and it's going to be fantastic. We've recorded it. Hopefully I've recorded it. We'll transcribe it and pore over it. And one of the things I found interesting in going through a transcription is how much you learn by listening to it a second time. So maybe people would like to do that once I've put it online.
Okay, thanks very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks, Liz.